The whispers began the moment Sarah stepped through the doorway, but she wouldn't understand their meaning until it was almost too late. Her husband Marcus brushed snow from his coat, laughing about their honeymoon adventure, while invisible fingers seemed to trace the walls around them. This wasn't supposed to be how love stories ended, with a woman's broken heart echoing through decades of silence. The old Victorian house loomed against the winter sky like a monument to forgotten promises. Marcus's uncle had offered them the place for their first getaway as newlyweds, far from the city's chaos. Perfect for young love, he'd said with that knowing smile. But as Sarah crossed the threshold, her skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The tall windows reflected nothing but darkness, and the wooden walls seemed to absorb their voices before they could fully form. Marcus's uncle led them through rooms that felt heavy with untold stories. "This house has seen its share of heartbreak," he mentioned casually, his weathered hands trailing along the banister. "But that's all ancient history now. Just old wives' tales and winter wind." Sarah forced a smile, but something in his eyes suggested he knew more than he was willing to share. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. That first night, exhaustion should have claimed them both. The house settled into silence, save for the wind that rattled the windows like skeletal fingers. Sarah nestled against Marcus's warmth, trying to ignore the feeling that they weren't alone. But sleep brought no peace. In the darkest hour before dawn, a voice drifted through the walls, soft, desperate, achingly familiar, though she'd never heard it before. "Sarah, Marcus." The whisper was closer than a breath, more intimate than a lover's call. Sarah's eyes flew open, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was empty, but the voice lingered like perfume in the air. She pressed closer to Marcus, who slept undisturbed, and forced herself to believe it was just the old house settling. But the sensation of being watched never left her, and she lay awake until sunrise painted the windows gold. Morning brought no relief from the previous night's unease. Marcus stretched and smiled, asking about her sleep with the casual affection of new marriage. Sarah couldn't bring herself to describe the voice that had called their names with such longing. Instead, she watched him dress and wondered if the house was already changing them, drawing them into its web of forgotten sorrows. While Sarah tried to shake off her fears, Marcus explored the house with the enthusiasm of discovery. The attic stairs groaned under his weight, each step echoing like a heartbeat. In the dusty corners where sunlight never reached, he found a wooden box carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the shadows. Inside, wrapped in yellowed silk, lay a photograph that made his blood run cold. The woman in the picture stood exactly where Sarah had stood the night before, but her smile was wrong, too wide, too knowing, as if she saw something beyond the camera's lens. Her eyes held a depth of sadness that seemed to reach across decades. Marcus's hands trembled as he studied the image, feeling as though those painted eyes were studying him in return. He closed the box quickly, but the woman's face was already burned into his memory. Downstairs, Sarah paced the living room like a caged animal. Her skin felt electric, alive with the constant sensation of unseen presence. When Marcus returned, she could see the fear in his eyes that matched her own. "This house is haunted," she whispered, the words tumbling out. Before she could stop them, "I can feel her watching us, waiting for something." Marcus didn't laugh or dismiss her fears. The photograph had shaken something loose in him, some primal recognition that they were not alone. "I found something in the attic," he said, quietly. A picture of a woman. She looked. He struggled for words. She looked like she was waiting for someone who would never come. That night, Neither of them pretended to sleep. They lay in bed, holding hands like children, afraid of the dark, when the voice came again. This time it was stronger, more insistent, calling. Both their names with a desperation that made Sarah's heart ache. Sarah, Marcus. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around them like a shroud. They found themselves rising without conscious thought, drawn by a force they couldn't name. The hallway stretched before them, darker than it should have been, shadows moving along the walls like living things. The air grew colder with each step, their breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid atmosphere. At the end of the hall, the attic door stood slightly ajar, and from within came that same pleading voice. Sarah, Marcus. The call was a lament, a prayer, a desperate plea that cut straight to their souls. They pushed open the door, and the sight that greeted them stole the breath from their lungs. She stood by the window, exactly as she had in the photograph, but now her anguish was palpable. Her white dress flowed around her like mist, and her dark hair framed a face carved from pure sorrow. She was beautiful and terrible, real and ethereal, a woman trapped between worlds by the weight of her own broken heart. When she turned to face them, her eyes held the accumulated pain of decades spent waiting. The temperature plummeted, and the woman's mouth opened in a silent scream that somehow filled the entire house. It was the sound of love turned to ash, of hope dying slowly over years of solitude. Sarah gripped Marcus's hand so tightly her knuckles went white, but neither of them could move, trapped by the raw emotion radiating from the ghostly figure. They fled then, stumbling down the stairs and locking the attic door behind them. Though they both knew locks meant nothing to the presence that haunted these halls. They spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, trying to process what they'd witnessed. The next morning brought answers that only deepened the mystery. Marcus's uncle listened to their story with the resignation of a man who'd carried secrets too long. Her name was Eleanor, he said finally. She lived here 60 years ago, waiting for her husband Thomas to return from America. He'd gone to find work, promised to send for her. But his ship, the old man's voice trailed off. She never stopped believing he'd come back. They say she died at that window, still watching the road. Why didn't you warn us? Marcus demanded, but his uncle just shrugged with the weariness of someone who'd seen too much. I hope the stories weren't true. But maybe some love is too strong for death too. Silence. That night, the house felt different. Not dangerous, but suffused with a sadness so profound it seemed to seep through the walls. They could sense Eleanor's presence, but it no longer felt threatening. Instead, it felt lonely, desperately, achingly lonely. Sarah found herself drawn to the attic window, where Eleanor had spent her final years. She imagined the woman standing there through changing seasons, watching for a figure that would never appear on the horizon. The depth of such devotion was both beautiful and tragic. A love so pure it had transcended death itself. We have to help her, Sarah whispered to Marcus. She's been waiting so long. They began to search the house for clues to Eleanor's story. In a forgotten drawer, they discovered her diary, its pages brittle with age but still readable. Sarah's voice broke as she read aloud Eleanor's entries, each one a window into a heart slowly breaking. Thomas sailed today. He promised to write every week. I'll count the days until his return. Still no word from Thomas, but I know he's working hard to build our future. I'll wait as long as it takes. The neighbors whisper that his ship was lost, but I don't believe them. Love this strong doesn't just disappear. He'll come back to me. The final entry was dated 3 years after Thomas's departure. I feel myself fading, but I won't. Leave this window. When Thomas comes home, I'll be here waiting. I'll always be here waiting. Marcus held Sarah as she wept for a woman she'd never known but somehow understood. Completely. They researched at the local library, finding newspaper clippings that confirmed their worst fears. Thomas's ship had indeed been lost at sea, but Eleanor had never accepted this truth. She'd wasted away at her window, dying of a broken heart while clinging to impossible hope. But their research uncovered something else, something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Thomas had survived the shipwreck. He'd been rescued by another vessel and spent years recovering from his injuries. By the time he'd made it back to search for Eleanor, she had been dead for decades. The man had spent his remaining years trying to find some trace of the woman who'd waited for him, dying alone and heartbroken just as she had. She never knew, Sarah whispered. She never knew he tried to come back. That evening, they returned to the attic with Eleanor's diary clutched in Sarah's hands. The temperature dropped the moment they entered, and Eleanor materialized by the window. Her eternal vigil unchanged by the passing of decades. Eleanor, Sarah said softly, stepping closer to the ghostly figure. We know your story. We know about Thomas, about how you waited for him. But we have something to tell you, something that might bring you peace. Eleanor's form flickered, and for the first time, her eyes focused on them with something approaching hope. Thomas survived, Marcus said gently. He was injured, lost, but he survived. He came back, looking for you, Eleanor. He searched for years, but by then, his voice caught. By then you were already gone. Eleanor's mouth opened in a silent gasp, and a single tear traced down her translucent cheek. The air in the room began to warm, and Sarah felt something shift in the house's atmosphere, as if a weight that had pressed down for decades was finally lifting. He never stopped loving you, Sarah continued, just as you never stopped loving him. But, Eleanor, he wouldn't want you to suffer like this. He'd want you to find peace, to let go of the pain that's kept you bound to this world. Eleanor looked down at the diary in Sarah's hands, and slowly she reached out. Her ghostly fingers passed through the book, but somehow Sarah understood what she needed. She opened the diary to the final entry and read it aloud, her voice carrying all the love and sorrow of a woman who'd waited beyond death itself. As the words filled the air, Eleanor's form began to brighten, becoming less solid but somehow more present. She looked at Sarah and Marcus with gratitude so profound it brought tears to their eyes. Then, slowly, she began to fade, her face finally at peace. The house exhaled, and suddenly it felt like home again. The shadows retreated, the air warmed, and the oppressive weight of accumulated sorrow lifted like morning mist. Eleanor was gone, but not forgotten. She had found her peace at last. Sarah and Marcus stayed 2 more days, and each night they lit a candle in the attic window, a beacon of remembrance for love that had transcended death. The house was quiet now, filled with the gentle silence of rest rather than the heavy quiet of waiting. On their last morning, as they packed their bags, Sarah placed a single white rose on the attic stairs. For Eleanor, she whispered, and for Thomas. They drove away slowly, watching the house recede in their rearview mirror. For the first time since they'd arrived, it looked like a home rather than a monument to sorrow. The windows reflected only sunlight now, and the shadows had lost their restless energy. At a small coffee shop hours later, they met an elderly man who recognized Eleanor's diary. I remember her, he said quietly. My grandmother worked at that house. She told me about the woman who waited at the window. But she also told me something else about a man who came back years later, old and broken, searching for someone he'd lost. He cried at her grave for hours before disappearing again. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances, their hearts heavy with the tragedy of love that had missed its chance by mere decades. But they also felt something else, a quiet satisfaction that they'd been able to give Eleanor what she'd needed most, the truth about Thomas's love, and permission to let go. The diary sits on their shelf now, a reminder that some loves are so powerful they can reach across death itself. Sometimes Sarah opens it and reads Eleanor's words, feeling connected to a woman whose capacity for devotion had been both her greatest gift and her deepest curse. The house stands empty but peaceful, its long vigil finally ended, holding only the memory of a love that was never forgotten, and a woman who learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to let go.